Hi, and welcome back again. In this video, we're going to be looking at relative clauses and relative pronouns. Relative clauses provide extra detail about some nominal in the main clause. The relative clause is connected to the main clause by a relative pronoun, which acts like the glue to hold the relative clause to that one nominal in the main clause. The English relative pronouns include who, that, and which. I might say, the teacher who helped me the most was very creative. The teacher there is the nominal that I'm going to explain more about. And the relative clause is who helped me the most. The who there points back to the teacher, and so we call the teacher the antecedent, and who is the relative pronoun. So the teacher, which teacher? The one who helped me the most. Notice that who helped me the most is a complete clause. It has its own verb, but it's not an independent clause. It can only be dependent on the main clause because the relative pronoun has to point back to an antecedent. I might also say, I need a pen that won't leak ink. The main clause there is just, I need a pen. But a pen is the antecedent for the relative pronoun that, and the relative clause is that won't leak ink. And that won't leak ink is describing something more about the pen that I need. I could say, I gave my book to a student who didn't have one. Here, student or a student is the antecedent, who is the relative pronoun, and who didn't have one is the relative clause. Again, I could just say I gave my book to a student, but I add the relative clause to say more about the student. Or I might say that's the student to whom I gave my book. Or I might say that's the teacher whose classes were so interesting. Don't confuse these pronouns with the interrogative pronoun. Particularly in English, we can use who or what or which in order to ask questions. But relative pronouns don't ask questions. You can have a relative clause in a question, but the relative pronoun itself isn't a question word. So there's a difference between who with a question mark and who the relative pronoun. The other thing to notice is that a relative clause has its own verb. So an interrogative pronoun won't be followed by any relative clause. It'll just be followed by the main clause. But the relative pronoun will be followed by a subordinate clause that has its own verb. Here are the forms of the Greek relative pronoun, and they're really quite easy, because they're just the first and second declension noun endings plus rough breathing. So if the regular second declension nominative masculine ending is os, we add a rough breathing to that and it becomes hos. Similarly, the nominative singular feminine relative pronoun is he. The one irregular place here, and it's not entirely irregular, is that in the neuter, the nominative is ha instead of hon, and the accusative likewise is ha instead of hon. Why? Well, these are pronouns, and if you remember, in our personal pronouns, auta was the neuter nominative singular, not auton. And so if you remember that with pronouns, you often drop that final nu when you're dealing with the neuter nominative and accusative, then you'll be able to remember that the same thing happens in the relative pronoun. The one thing that can be tricky here is actually typing the relative pronoun, because you have to type a rough breathing with an iota subscript when you come to the dative singular relative pronouns. And Some operating systems, like Linux, will let you just pile up dead keys. So you type the dead key for the iota subscript, you type the dead key for the breathing mark, and then the letter. And all three of those keystrokes combine to give you your relative pronoun. Windows, though, doesn't allow the combining of or piling up of subsequent dead keys like that. You have to press one key combination to produce the combination of the rough breathing and the iota subscript. And it's a little bit tricky because you have to hold Control, Alt, and Shift and the quotation mark, the single quotation mark or apostrophe. Hold all four of those keys at the same time, then release them, then type or press the key for the letter that you want. In this case, H for Ada. So if I hold Control Alt Shift, type the apostrophe, and then press the H key on Windows, that will give me what you see here, hey, with the iota subscript. A Greek relative clause, then, is the relative pronoun plus the clause it introduces. The pronoun stands in for the antecedent nominal, and the clause says something about that nominal. In this example, arton echo is the main clause, arton providing the direct object for the main verb echo, and hos, at the beginning of the relative pronoun, picks up or points back to that arton. So arton echo hos kalos estin. Kalos estin is something that we want to say about that arton. So I have a loaf of bread, an arton, which, hos, kalos estin, which is fresh. One of the interesting things about relative pronouns is that they look two directions. A little bit like this coin image of the Roman god Janus, who had two faces. On the one hand, the relative pronoun agrees with their antecedent in the main clause in gender and number. So hos, in this example, is masculine and singular because arton is masculine and singular. And that helps us know what nominal is the antecedent. But the relative pronoun is also occupying a nominal's role in the subordinate clause. Here, hos is playing the role of the subject. And so this role in the subordinate clause, in the relative clause, is what determines the case of the relative pronoun. So did you get that? The gender and number come from the antecedent, but the case comes from the role of the relative pronoun in the relative clause. That's why, although arton here is the direct object of echo, and so it's in the accusative case, hos is in the nominative case. Why? Because it's the subject of estin in the relative clause. I have a loaf of bread, which, subject, is fresh. Now, one of the important things to recognize is that in a relative clause, the relative pronoun can actually play any role that a nominal usually plays. So it is possible that we could have the relative pronoun as the direct object of the verb in the relative clause. Arton echo, hon, now instead of hos, hon Sophia epoiesin. I have a loaf of bread, which Sophia made. The loaf of bread, which is represented by hon, which, is now the direct object of epoiesin, she made. So here, the arton and the hon happen to be in the same case, accusative, but not because arton determines it, but because hon, the relative pronoun, is itself acting as the direct object of epoiesin. You can learn more about relative clauses and the Greek relative pronoun in Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek, and I've given you the section and page numbers for the 3rd edition, and also in Wallace's Basics of New Testament Syntax, and I've given you the page numbers for the 1st edition.